Have you ever watched someone shut a door so hard they were certain it could never open again? Dimitri did that to me 3 years ago, on the 42nd floor of Thornfield Capitol, with a hand on my elbow he didn't have the right to put there. "You'll never set foot on this floor again," he said, walking me past the glass offices where people I'd hired pretended not to watch. The elevator doors closed on his face, satisfied, final. He was right about one thing. I never did set foot on that floor again. Not as an employee. This morning I walked back into the Thornfield boardroom for the first time since that day. Same walnut table, same skyline, same Dimitri at the head of it, mid-sentence, until he looked up and saw who'd just been seated as the controlling board's newest member. He stood up too fast. The chair rolled back and hit the credenza. And for the first time in 3 years, I watched him understand exactly who he'd put in that elevator. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who keeps a list of the people who underestimated me, but I started one the week I left Thornfield Capitol, and I kept it in the back of a notebook I carried to every meeting for 3 years. It wasn't a list for revenge. It was a list for clarity. Names of people who had looked at me and decided, in a single glance, exactly how high I was allowed to climb. Dimitri Voss was the first name on it. He'd written himself there. For 6 years, I'd been head of strategy at Thornfield Capitol, a mid-sized fund managing somewhere north of $8 billion in assets, run out of a glass tower downtown where the 42nd floor belonged to the people who mattered and everyone else fought for windows. I'd come to Thornfield from a research desk nobody had heard of, and I'd done the one thing that's supposed to guarantee your place at a firm like that. I'd made them money. My strategy team had built the models that anchored 3 of the fund's largest positions, and in my last full year, the calls my desk made had accounted for a number that, when the partners said it out loud in the annual meeting, made the room go quiet in the way money makes rooms go quiet. It didn't matter. At Thornfield, performance was the price of admission, not a seat at the table. The seats were decided by something else, by who you'd gone to school with, who you golfed with, whose father had introduced you to whose. I had none of those credentials. I had a name people mispronounced in meetings and a habit of being right that some men experienced as an accusation. Dimitri was the chief operating officer, and he was very good at the thing Thornfield actually rewarded, which was the management of perception. He didn't build models. He built narratives about who was a team player and who was difficult, about which results were the firm's and which were merely an individual's luck. For 2 years, he'd been quietly rewriting the story of my desk's performance into the story of his operational leadership, and I'd let him, because I believed, the way smart people often stupidly believe, that the work would speak for itself. The work does not speak for itself. People speak, and Dimitri spoke more and louder and to the right people. The first real warning came in a Tuesday strategy review in the big conference room with the bad acoustics where you had to lean in to be heard. I'd presented a thesis, a contrarian position on a sector everyone else at the table wanted to exit, and I'd backed it with 11 months of modeling. Dimitri waited until I finished. "It's an interesting academic exercise," he said, in the tone you'd use for a child's drawing. "But Inessa, with respect, you build the models. We make the decisions. There's a difference between the people who do the analysis and the people who carry the risk." He smiled around the table. "No offense. We need our analysts. We just don't need them confusing themselves with principles." A few of the men laughed, the specific low laugh of people relieved it wasn't aimed at them. I'd hired 2 of them. I didn't argue. I'd learned that arguing in that room only confirmed the story he was telling, that I was emotional, that I didn't understand my place, that I was difficult. I gathered my materials and said, "Noted. The position's in the deck if anyone wants to revisit it." 6 weeks later, the sector moved exactly the way my model said it would, and Thornfield missed it, and not one person mentioned the deck again. That's the thing about being right at the wrong altitude. It doesn't lift you. It just makes you inconvenient. I went home that night and added a line to the notebook. Not Dimitri's name. That was already there. Just an observation. They will never promote what they've decided to manage. The end, when it came, was almost administrative. A reorganization. Thornfield loved a reorganization, the way some firms love anything that lets them reshuffle power without admitting they're doing it. Strategy was being integrated into the broader investment platform, which meant my team was being parceled out under 3 different managers, none of whom understood what we did, all of whom reported to Dimitri. My own role was being elevated to an advisory capacity, a phrase that in this business means the same thing a velvet rope means. You may look at the party, but you are no longer in it. I asked Dimitri directly, in his office, with the door closed. "Is this you removing me?" He leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head, comfortable in a way that told me he'd been waiting for the question. "Inessa, nobody's removing you. We're recognizing that your talents are better suited to a different kind of contribution. You're brilliant, truly. But brilliance isn't leadership, and at some point you have to be honest with yourself about which one you have." He let that sit. "Take the advisory role, it's generous, or don't. But understand that the train's leaving the station, and you can either be on it in a way that makes sense, or you can be standing on the platform telling everyone how the train should be run." I looked at him for a long moment. Outside his window, the city was doing the thing it does at dusk, the lights coming up floor by floor, indifferent. "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't take the advisory role. 2 weeks later, after I'd quietly told the firm I'd be leaving to explore other opportunities, Dimitri made his single mistake. Not a strategic one, just a human one, the kind arrogance always eventually makes. He decided that letting me leave wasn't enough. He needed to walk me out himself. He met me at my office, where I'd already packed 1 small box. I'd never let myself accumulate more than 1 box at any job. Another lesson learned young. He put a hand on my elbow, steering, performing for the floor. "I'll see you down," he said. And as the elevator came, with people I'd mentored watching over the tops of their monitors, he leaned in close enough that only I could hear. "You'll never set foot on this floor again. Nothing personal. You just aimed higher than you are." The doors closed. I rode 42 floors down holding a cardboard box, and somewhere around the 20th floor, I stopped feeling humiliated and started feeling something much colder and much more useful. I made a phone call from the lobby, the first of many. The phone call I made from the Thornfield lobby was to a man named Soren Holt. I'd met Soren 18 months earlier at an industry dinner, the kind where most of the conversation is people measuring each other's net worth through small talk. He ran Wren Holt Partners, a private equity firm with a reputation for 2 things, patience and precision. They didn't chase headlines. They took quiet, controlling positions in undervalued firms, fixed what was broken, and held. Over dessert that night, Soren had asked me a question no one at Thornfield had ever asked. Not what my models predicted, but how I'd been wrong and what I'd learned from it. We talked for 2 hours. He'd remembered me. People who build things for a living usually remember the people who actually build. When I called him from that lobby, box under my arm, I didn't ask for a job. I asked for a meeting. There's a difference, and Soren understood it. But this is the part that matters, and it's the part Dimitri never once considered. Because men like Dimitri believe that when they close a door, the room behind it ceases to exist. Leaving Thornfield was not the end of my relationship with Thornfield. It was the beginning of a different one. Because I knew things about Thornfield that I'd built into my bones over 6 years, not secrets, nothing improper, just the kind of deep operational knowledge that only the person who actually does the work ever has. I knew which of the fund's positions were genuinely strong, and which were narratives Dimitri had inflated to protect his own standing. I knew the firm's cost structure was bloated, that its returns had been quietly declining for 3 years while its marketing had gotten louder. I knew that Thornfield's founder, an aging man named Walter Crane, who'd built the firm in the 80s and now spent most of his time on his boat, had grown disengaged, and that Dimitri had been steadily consolidating operational control in the vacuum. And I knew the one thing that mattered most, that under that polished surface, Thornfield was a firm whose value was drifting away from its price. I didn't tell Soren any of this as a pitch. I told him as analysis, the way I'd tell anyone, because being right was the only currency I'd ever fully trusted. We had lunch, then we had 3 more. And over those months, while Dimitri was no doubt telling people I'd washed out and couldn't handle the pressure, I was doing what I'd always done, building a model. This one wasn't for a position. It was for an acquisition. Ren Holt brought me on as a principal first, then promoted me to partner inside of a year, which Thornfield would have taken 5 years and 3 reorganizations to do, if they ever did it at all. The work was the same work I'd always done. The only thing that had changed was that I was now in a building where being right lifted me instead of marking me. I led the diligence on 6 deals in my first 18 months. I built Ren Holt's analytical engine into something the firm hadn't had before. And the whole time, in the back of my mind and the back of my notebook, Thornfield sat. A firm I understood better than the man now running it, drifting slowly toward the price at which it would become exactly the kind of target Ren Holt liked. I want to be clear about something, because this is where people assume the story is pettier than it was. I did not engineer Thornfield's decline. I didn't have to. Dimitri did that himself. With 3 years of choosing perception over performance, of promoting loyalists over talent, of letting the models rot because the people who built them had been managed out or driven away. By the time Thornfield's numbers became impossible to spin, half the strategy talent I'd hired had followed me out the door, scattered across better firms. Dimitri had been so busy protecting his throne that he'd let the kingdom hollow. What I did was simpler. I waited and I watched, and when the moment came, I was the one person in the room who knew exactly what Thornfield was worth and exactly how to take it. The moment came on a gray morning in the firm's deal review meeting, when one of our analysts flagged a fund showing classic distressed acquisition signals, declining returns, redemptions accelerating, a disengaged founder, and a valuation that had finally fallen below the value of its underlying book. He put the name on the screen. Thornfield Capital. I felt the room turn to me, because by then everyone at Ren Holt knew where I'd come from. Soren looked at me across the table, and there was a question in his face, not whether I could be objective, but whether I wanted to be the one to lead it. He was giving me the choice. That, more than the partnership, more than the salary, was the thing that told me I'd finally landed somewhere that saw me. "I know this firm better than anyone outside its walls," I said. "Probably better than most people inside them. I can tell you exactly where the value is, exactly what's overstated, and exactly how to structure a controlling position." I paused. "And I can tell you that the single biggest problem with Thornfield Capital is sitting in the COO's chair, and that any deal we do should be conditioned on the board's authority to remove him." Soren didn't smile exactly, but he nodded the slow nod of a man who has just watched a thesis assemble itself in real time. Then build the model, he said. I built the model. We approached Walter Crane through back channels first, the aging founder, tired, watching his life's work decline, more receptive than Dmitri ever imagined to the idea of a clean, quiet exit at a fair price. Ren Holt structured a controlling stake. Walter took the deal, and one of the conditions, written into the term sheet on the very first draft, the one line I made sure never came out, granted the acquiring firm 2 seats on a reconstituted board with full authority over executive personnel. Dmitri didn't know any of it was happening. Why would he? In his version of the story, I was 3 years gone. A cautionary tale he told junior analysts about people who aimed higher than they were. He found out the way arrogant men always find out things, last and in public. Let me pause here, because the morning the deal closed, I sat in my car in the Ren Holt garage for a full 10 minutes before I could make myself drive to Thornfield, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't nerves. It was that I'd imagined this so many times in 3 years that I was afraid the real thing would feel smaller than the version I'd built. So tell me, down in the comments, have you ever gotten the chance to walk back into a room you were thrown out of? And did it feel the way you thought it would? I genuinely want to know. And if you've ever been the name on someone's list of people they underestimated, stay with me and subscribe. Because what happened when I walked into that boardroom was the part even I didn't see coming. The notification came at 6:14 on a Wednesday morning, and I'd been awake for it without admitting to myself that I was waiting. Transaction closed. Funds disbursed. Board reconstitution effective immediately. 3 lines on a screen. The end of 3 years of patience, arriving with all the drama of a calendar reminder. By 8, I was in the lobby of the Thornfield Tower, the same lobby where I'd made my first phone call with a cardboard box under my arm. The security desk had my name on a list now, flagged with 2 words that hadn't been there before. Board member. The guard, a man named Felix who'd worked that desk for a decade, looked at the screen, then up at me, and something moved across his face that might have been recognition or might have been the beginning of a smile he was too professional to finish. "Welcome back, Ms. Okonkwo," he said. "Thank you, Felix. It's good to see a familiar face." The elevator climbed. 42 floors. I'd ridden this car down once, holding everything I owned at that company in a single box. I rode it up now, holding nothing but a leather folder, and the difference in weight was the whole story. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered it. The long walnut table, the skyline behind glass, the faint hum of climate control that never quite went away. The board was already assembling for the first meeting under new ownership. Soren and one other Ren Holt partner, 2 of Thornfield's remaining independent directors, and Walter Crane himself, looking older and lighter than I remembered, the way men look when they've finally set something down. And Dmitri. He was at the head of the table, mid-sentence, holding court the way he'd held court for years, explaining to the room how he envisioned the transition, how his operational leadership would be essential to continuity, how he looked forward to partnering with our new investors. He hadn't been told who the new board members were. The deal had moved through Walter and Soren and a wall of attorneys, and Dmitri, so certain of his own centrality, had assumed he'd be in every room that mattered. He'd never imagined a room could be assembled specifically so that he wouldn't see me coming. I took the seat that had been assigned to me. Soren introduced the board members one by one, calm and procedural, and when he reached my chair, he simply said, "And Inessa Okonkwo, partner at Ren Holt, who led the diligence on this transaction and will hold one of our 2 board seats." Dmitri stood up too fast. The chair rolled back and struck the credenza with a sound that made one of the independent directors flinch. For a moment, he just stared at me, and I watched 3 years of his carefully maintained narrative collapse behind his eyes in real time. The cautionary tale he'd been telling, the woman who'd aimed too high, sitting now at the table he'd thrown her from, with the authority to decide whether he kept his job. "Inessa," he said. My name came out wrong, the way it always had in his mouth, but this time the carelessness sounded like panic instead of contempt. This is a surprise. Nobody mentioned—" "Please sit down, Dmitri," I said. Evenly, kindly even. "We have a lot to get through." He sat. He had to. That was the first thing he understood, that in this room, for the first time in our history, the instructions flowed in the other direction. The meeting was, on its surface, ordinary. Transition logistics, governance structure, the standard reconstitution business. But underneath it, everyone in that room with any instinct for power could feel the floor tilting, and Dmitri could feel it most of all. Every time a decision came to the board, he watched my hand. Every time I spoke, he recalibrated. He'd spent 6 years deciding how high I was allowed to climb, and he was now doing frantic arithmetic on how far he had left to fall. The flashback that kept rising in me, sitting in that chair, wasn't the day he walked me out. It was a smaller thing. A Thursday years earlier, when I'd stayed past midnight rebuilding a model that had broken 3 days before a major position, and Dmitri had walked through on his way out, seen me there, and said, without stopping, "Don't burn yourself out on the small stuff. Leave something for the people who'll still be here in 5 years. He'd meant himself. He'd been so sure he'd be the one still in the building. And here we both were, 5 years on, and only one of us had been right about who'd be holding the room. Midway through the meeting, Soren turned to me and said, "Inessa, you flagged a personnel review as a condition of the transaction. Do you want to speak to the board's authority there, or table it for the next session?" This was the moment. Dimitri's eyes came to me, and I saw him understand what was about to happen, that the personnel review had my name on it, that I had written the condition that would decide his future into the deal before he'd even known the deal existed. "Let's table the formal review for the next session," I said, "so everyone has the documentation in front of them." I looked at Dmitri, and I let the kindness drop just enough for him to see what was underneath it. "But I'd like Dmitri to prepare a full account of the firm's operational decisions over the last 3 years for that meeting. Strategy allocation, talent retention, the reorganization of the research function." I paused. "I'd like to understand the choices that brought the firm to a valuation that made this acquisition possible. I think the board deserves a complete picture before it makes any decisions about leadership." The color left his face by degrees, because he knew, finally, fully, that I understood every one of those decisions better than he did, that I'd been in the building when he made them, that I'd watched him trade the firm's substance for his own standing, and that I was about to make him stand in front of a board and narrate his own undoing, line by line, the same way he'd once made me stand in conference rooms and defend work he was busy claiming. "Of course," Dmitri said. 2 words. It was all he had. I closed my folder. Outside the glass, the city was bright and indifferent, and 42 floors below it, somewhere, was the lobby where this had started. The personnel review was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Dmitri spent the intervening week doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was campaign. I heard about it the way you hear about everything in a firm where you once hired half the staff, through the quiet network of people who remember who treated them like talent. He took the remaining loyalists to lunch. He called 2 of the independent directors to align on continuity, He even reached out to Walter Crane, the founder, trying to reactivate an old loyalty, not understanding that Walter had already set the firm down and walked away, and that a man who has let go of something does not pick it back up to defend the person who hollowed it. By Wednesday, Dmitri had assembled exactly nothing, because the narrative he'd lived on for years only worked in a building where he controlled the microphone, and he no longer did. Thursday's meeting was fuller than the last. The full reconstituted board, Ren Holt's 2 seats, the independent directors, Walter present by his own choice, and Dmitri at the foot of the table now, not the head. The seating had quietly changed, and everyone noticed, and no one mentioned it. I'd brought a single bound document. I set it in front of me and didn't open it right away. Before we begin the leadership review, Soren said, Inessa will frame the analysis the board commissioned as part of diligence. Inessa. I opened the document. 3 years ago, I said, Thornfield Capital managed just over $8 billion with a 5-year track record in the top quartile of its peer group. Today, it manages $5.1 billion, with returns that have trailed its benchmark for 11 consecutive quarters. I turned a page. I want to be precise, because precision matters here. This decline did not happen because the markets turned. It happened because of specific operational choices made by specific people and documented in the firm's own records, which, as a board member, I've now reviewed in full. Dmitri shifted in his chair. Inessa, with respect, attributing a complex multi-year performance story to, I'm not finished, I said. Quietly. He stopped. It was the first time in our entire history that I had told Dmitri Voss to wait, and the room registered the reversal like a change in pressure. In the last 3 years, I continued, Thornfield lost 9 of its 11 senior strategy professionals. I've listed them, with their destinations, on page 4. 7 of them now work at firms that have outperformed Thornfield over the same period. They didn't leave for money. I've spoken to most of them. They left because the firm systematically promoted loyalty over performance, and because the operational leadership, I let the phrase land, treated its analytical talent as a cost to be managed rather than an asset to be retained. The research function was reorganized 3 times in 2 years, each time consolidating control and degrading output. The models that anchored this firm's best positions were allowed to decay because the people who built them were driven out. I looked up at him then, not in triumph, just directly. I know this, I said, because I built 3 of those models, and I was the first of the 9 to leave. The silence in the room was total. Walter Crane was looking at Dmitri now, and there was something terrible in an old man's face when he finally sees what was done to the thing he built. Dmitri's composure broke the way these things always break, not all at once, but in a sudden rush once the first crack gives. This is a personal vendetta, he said, and his voice had climbed half an octave. She was let go 3 years ago. Performance issues, attitude issues, it's all documented. And now she's engineered this entire acquisition to settle a score. Walter, you know me. Soren, you have to see what's happening here. She's not objective. She can't be on a board that's reviewing. I was not let go, I said. I resigned after being offered an advisory role designed to remove me without the firm having to admit it was removing me. You walked me to the elevator yourself, Dmitri. You said, and I'm quoting you precisely because I wrote it down that night, you'll never set foot on this floor again. You just aimed higher than you are. I closed the document. I'm on the floor, Dmitri. I'm at the table. And it turns out I aimed exactly as high as I am. He turned to the directors, to Soren, to Walter, looking for the wall that men like him always assume is there, the structure that has always caught them. You can't let her do this. Whatever she's telling you, the operational record will show. The operational record is page 4 through 19, I said. It's in front of you. Read it at your leisure. But the board isn't going to make this decision on the basis of either of our characterizations. It's going to make it on the basis of 11 quarters of performance, 9 departures, 3 reorganizations, and a valuation that fell far enough to make this firm an acquisition target. I turned to Soren and the directors. I'd like to recuse myself from the vote, to remove any question of bias. I've presented the analysis. The decision belongs to the rest of you. It was the right move, and I'd known it would be since the first night I sat in my car in the garage. I didn't need to cast the vote. I'd already won the moment the facts were on the table, and Dmitri had nothing but the sound of his own voice climbing. I stepped out. The vote took 11 minutes. When they called me back in, Soren didn't have to say it. I could read it in the room. Dmitri was sitting very still, staring at the walnut grain of the table he'd presided over for years, a man who had finally run out of narrative. The board had voted to remove him as Chief Operating Officer, effective immediately. You'll be offered a standard separation package, Soren told him, not unkindly. Legal will be in touch this afternoon. Dmitri stood. Slowly this time. He gathered nothing, because he'd brought nothing but himself, and at the door he stopped and looked back at me, the way I'd once stopped and not looked back at him. Nothing personal, I said. You just aimed higher than you are. Dmitri Voss left the Thornfield Tower the same way everyone leaves these towers in the end, through the lobby, past the security desk, out into a gray morning that did not care who he had been. There was no box. He had an assistant gather his office and courier it to him because he could not bring himself to ride the elevator down in front of the floor while it watched. I understood that better than he'd ever know. I just had the courage to do it the hard way. The firm did not collapse. That's worth saying, because the satisfying version of this story is the one where the bad man's removal brings the whole edifice down, and that isn't what happened, and it isn't what I wanted. Ren Holt doesn't buy firms to burn them. We rebuilt Thornfield the way Soren had rebuilt a dozen others, patiently, precisely. I led the reconstruction of the strategy function personally. The first thing I did was call the 9 people who'd left. 7 of them took the meeting. 4 of them came back, to a firm that now promoted performance over pedigree, that paid its analysts like the assets they were, that had a board member who knew the difference between someone doing the work and someone narrating it. Within 18 months, Thornfield's returns had climbed back above its benchmark. The valuation that had made it an acquisition target became, in time, the foundation of one of Ren Holt's best-performing positions. The work, it turned out, did speak. It had just needed a building that knew how to listen. Dmitri surfaced occasionally, the way these men do. He landed at a smaller fund, then left it, then started advising, which in this business is what you call it when no one will give you a seat. I heard, through the same quiet network that had once told me about his lunches, that he'd taken to telling a new version of the story, one where he'd seen the acquisition coming, where he'd graciously stepped aside, where it had all been part of some larger plan of his own. People who knew the truth let him tell it. There's no cruelty quite so clean as letting an arrogant man narrate his own decline to a room that already knows. I kept the notebook. The list is still in the back of it, and Dmitri's name is still the first one, but I drew a single line through it the night the board voted. Not crossed out in anger, just closed, the way you close an account that's finally settled. I've added a few names since. I imagine I always will. It's a useful list. It tells me, at a glance, who has already told me exactly how high they think I'm allowed to climb. The last time I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, I caught myself remembering the weight of that cardboard box and how certain Dmitri had been, standing there with his hand on my elbow, that he was watching the end of something. He was. He just had the direction wrong. That's the thing nobody tells you about being underestimated. The people who shut the door on you are so busy enjoying the sound of it closing that they never think to ask where you'll go next. They assume down. They always assume down. I took the elevator higher.